Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and every other Monday, I sit down with the people behind the video games you know and love. On today's episode, I sat down with one of the writers behind the video game Under the Waves. Let's meet our guest and get into the interview.
Yeah, my name's Rik Godwin. I am a writer and narrative designer, and I was the lead writer on Under the Waves. Pretty much everything in that game that's on screen that's in English is me, aside from the loading screens. And yeah, I was working on it for about 2 years.
Awesome. So what was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating video games?
Oh, wow. I have played video games since I can remember. I think one of the very first Christmas presents I remember getting, it was a Commodore 64, which I don't even know if that made it over. I don't even know if that was a thing in the States or outside of the UK, because I'm from the UK, obviously. And yeah, it was actually our neighbors' Commodore 64 that they had sort of got an Amiga, they'd upgraded. So my parents sort of had no idea what any of this stuff was. So they bought this Commodore 64. And I remember playing like Paperboy and all these sort of things. And, you know, I then got a Mega Drive, a couple of Sega Genesis, Mega Drive in the UK a few years later. And then that turned into a gaming PC in 95. And it was this evolution that games went, in my mind, from something that was just like Paperboy, you know, trying to get to the end of the level and not get, you know, attacked by a small dog made of like 7 pixels, to these sort of narrative, this emerging narrative medium that I was growing up alongside, if that makes sense. I don't want to say that there were no narrative games before like 93. There absolutely was. But I think the medium as a sort of real narrative contemporary to, you know, film and TV sort of evolved as I was there during that evolution. And it was really games like, ones that still stand out in my mind are games like BioShock that tell a story that goes beyond, you know, the primary verb in that game is still shooting, but the story goes beyond that. And I've always wanted a game set in that sort of, specifically Rapture, that isn't about shooting, that isn't about, you know, just seeing how many people you can gun down, because that story was about something more. And that in fact inspired me to go out and read Atlas Fallen, which is a horrible book. Objectivism is a terrible way of living your life, but it sort of was one of those first games that inspired me to go out and expand my own knowledge, and wanting to sort of write. I always wrote. That was always my thing. The sole thing I could say I was happy saying I was good at. And then yeah, luckily I've been extremely lucky in that I've had the chance to start writing for games and to sort of put myself into these little narrative adventures that we've been making.
So how did you all first come up with the idea for Under the Waves, and what did the initial brainstorming process look like for the game?
So with Under the Waves, it was actually an interesting process from my end because I wasn't there for that. I actually don't work. So the studio that made Under the Waves, Parallel Studios, I don't actually work for Parallel. I work for a company called Act Zero. And we're pretty sure, I'm based in France, and we are the only narrative design agency for games in France that we know of. Mm-hmm. And essentially what we do is we follow the model of companies like Sweet Baby in the States and Tailspinners in the UK, whereas we're often asked to consult and then actually come in and write or design games based around narratives. And with Under the Waves, what happened was we were initially asked to do an audit, actually, which was basically they would send us over all of the documentation that they had. This was at the point where there wasn't really a viable build to even show us. So we got all of like the world building documents, the character sheets, an overview of the story. I might be wrong here, but I don't think there was any written, even placeholder text at the time. But we were basically asked to have a look at everything, come back with, you know, the what isn't working, and most importantly, sort of the solutions to potentially what wasn't working. And we obviously did a reasonable job on that because Ronan, the director, came back to us and said, like, look, we'd like your help enacting some of these changes. The initial documents we were given were solid. They were good. The problems we had were very small. And then I sort of did a bunch of writing for the first things I ever wrote for the game were the calls between Stan and Emma. So in the game Under the Waves is obviously it's about this guy Stan. He's a deep sea diver working for this big oil company in a sort of alternate 1970s, sort of a bit of a sort of techno retro set 1970s. And one of the key relationships in that game, he's on his own for most of it. One of the key relationships is with his wife, Emma. And they have, across the course of the game takes place over about 3 weeks. And I wrote a bunch of the conversations between Stan and Emma, these sort of rather fraught telephone conversations. And Ronan was happy with that. Like, he was like, yep, that was good. And Sebastian Renard, he's a co-founder of Parallel with Ronan and Nicholas, who did the music on the game. And Seb is perhaps best known. He is one of the creative forces behind the Plague Tale series. And he had written this idea, the overarching story of Stan's journey and what compelled him to go down under the waves. But when I started, there was that basic overview. The characters were there in, like, they had character sheets, but their personalities weren't created through dialogue yet. So really, when I started, it was working with Ronan and Margot, the narrative and the other narrative designer, to create these characters and fit them into this sort of overarching framework that Sebastian had created. So yeah, it was an unorthodox sort of way to come on, because I wasn't there at the conception.
How much of the overarching story that you looked at the start stayed the same and is what players now see?
Well, this is it. This is a testament to how strong it was. Most of it, like, some of the individual beats certainly changed, but the overarching story and the themes were very strong. That was one of the things we came back with to Parallel, was that the themes were apparent from the start. And often that we find when we do these audits is that games have these narratives that aren't saying anything. The themes aren't there. There's no ideas behind it. It's like, it's a story. You want to, I think, people are naturally storytellers, and we want to put something onto these games to sort of drive the player through the mechanics. But a lot of times the theme and what the game is, the core concept of the game is sometimes a bit muddled, and we help try and narrow that down. But with Under the Waves, that theme, I don't think it's not a spoiler. I'm not going to get into any story spoilers with the game, but the idea of grief really was at the center of the game, and that remained the same. And what happened with the actual individual story points was that we expanded them quite a lot. The first real version of the game was a lot shorter in terms of narrative. It only took place over, I think, 7 or 8 days. And it was felt after it was all in the build and people had played through it, that the sort of themes and topics we were dealing with were a little bit too intense to happen over that shorter period of time. It didn't really feel true to life that, someone could work through these feelings in such a condensed period of time. So what we did is, and this was Ronan's idea, and I think it was a really good one, is that we put the ellipsis in the middle. So about halfway through the game, it goes from day 3. I think, don't quote me on that, I think it goes from day 3 to day 13 or 14. There's a time skip. And the aim of that was to sort of give the impression that, time had passed. In fact, if you look in Stan's, he keeps a diary. In fact, he's mandated by the company to keep a diary for psychological health reasons. And if you look in the diary after that time lapse, there's a diary entry for every day. So we were trying to hammer home that he's been sitting with this job for a while. He's more confident in his role, and he's sort of had time to sort of gestate on the feelings that are being brought up. So that was the big major change. I think there were a few character points at the beginning that we sort of, there were a couple of characters that existed that didn't really bring much tension to the game. They were good characters, but there was no conflict. And, drama comes from conflict. And we wanted to, one of our suggestions was to change one character especially, basically into a villain. And that was sort of my feeling, was that the game has this overarching villain of the company. unitrench, this huge sort of shell standing, but it doesn't have a face for that. And I was initially a bit worried that that was going to be an absence, that players were going to think, oh, well, you know, we don't have anything to, we're being told, like the environmental themes of the game are very strong. And I was a bit worried that players weren't going to have somewhere to direct the sort of frustration we were hoping to get about this idea of environmental protection. And the sole representative we have of that company is Tim, who is Stan's supervisor, an old friend of Tim's dad, and now working for this oil company. And we suggested that he be the villain, really. And that was a bit too much for Parallel. They did their front and run, and they didn't want to twist him to that extent. But he did go through a bit of an evolution from being sort of completely on Stan's side throughout the whole game to having a sort of, we hope, sort of a journey from being a salary man, you know, an everyday worker, not loyal to the company, but that's his priority, to then sort of shifting more back towards humanity. But generally, like remarkably, most of it remained very consistent over the entire course of development.
Managing scope is a really important aspect of creating video games. How did you work to manage the scope while you were working on Under the Waves? And how did it change from what you started with to what's now been published?
That's a really good question. Scope is one of those things, again, as we're often as we are, or I am, it's consultants, that scope is, and feature creep essentially is one of those things that really can trip even really experienced companies up. So yeah, as mentioned before, the game did expand in size a little bit. And for me as the writer, it wasn't even the main sort of quest line for that. So in the game, it's semi-open world. So you have the main plot that essentially you can follow. There are some points when you're railroaded into following it, but most of the time, especially at the start, you can essentially explore. Like there's wrecks around. There's a photo sort of mini game, and you can sort of go off and do what you want for a while until you come back to the story. But that main story, when we expanded, was the story's fairly linear. There's no choices really. There's one at the end. There's a choice right at the very end of the game. So the expansion of the story, as I mentioned, wasn't actually that much more work. Where I felt the scope creeping in was in the barks and the incidental dialogue. And barks are always a super important part of games like this. And it's very difficult to get that balance right, because you don't want situations where the player's being overwhelmed by the character constantly nattering at them, especially in a game like this, which is largely about contemplation as well. I think Ronan was very keen about the player being sort of feeling alone and isolated. But what happened at some stage was that the sheer amount of underwater animals, it massively grew. It went from, I couldn't even give figures, but it went from, you know, like I think maybe 20 or 30. I think there might be 60 plus maybe different types of animals. And each one of those has, again, it went from 5 barks to, so there would be an initial encounter bark, and then we'd have the sort of repeat barks that would play out once Stan sees these things a few times. And those expanded as well. Some of the sort of like hero animals, so like the whales and the sharks and the octopus, things like that, they expanded to like 15, I think, barks in some cases. And then we had all of the materials, because there's a light crafting element. And then we had all of the wrecks, because that's part, you know, exploring. There's a series of collectibles that unlocks concept art and also some sort of backstory to Stan and the general world of the game. Those increased. And it was never, for me, it was never overwhelming. It was simply a lot of work. And I think, again, Ronan really managed that well, because the idea of the game did massively change in terms of size. I think it started as a much smaller game even before I went on. I think in the making of that went up on YouTube, Ronan suggested that it was a 2D game originally. And then we also partnered with Surfrider, who are an ecological charity, and we wanted a lot of focus on that, on this environmental aspect of the game. A large part of it is about this oil company destroy the world gets gradually worse around you because, it's an oil company and a particularly, stingy one at that. And we then added a lot about incidental details about environmental damage and also about Surfrider itself. So there were several different themes that were building, and they led to a lot of these incidental dialogues that sort of took a lot of time to do, as Barks are want to do. But again, unlike some other projects I've been on, because it was managed so well from Parallel side, I never felt that, sort of slightly sinking feeling in your chest, like this is too much, like this is not going to work. We've had other games I've worked on where it's like that's not going to make it in, or if it does, it's going to be half-hearted, because when people get so excited about these projects, they want to put in everything they can think of and make it the best game they possibly can. And I get it. I've done that as well. And in this case, it wasn't really the case. Ronan had a very clear idea of what he wanted. When it did expand, it was done sensibly within scope. And I never felt like it was getting away from me. That horrible feeling when you're sort of like, oh, this is getting away from me. Never felt that. So yeah, it was a very pleasant experience, and it was all fairly smooth sailing. Haha, bad pun.
So I saw in the credits that you all used motion capture to create some of these cutscenes. What was it like to work with the motion capture and voice actors to bring these characters to life?
So unfortunately, I didn't work with the motion captures. I did work with the voice actors, so I can speak to that, certainly. The motion capture was done largely before I came on, which we've had that in other games where cutscenes have been done and there's no getting around them. Once it's expensive to do, it's time consuming to do, and then something goes wrong and that cutscene has to be thrown out. I'm not entirely sure this is the case, but as far as I understand, the majority of the motion capture that was done at the start went into the game. But unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to work on that. I did have a chance to work on the voice, and that's always one of my favorite parts of a game development. And I went down it was actually all recorded in the Quantic Dream Studios in Paris, which is where they did the teaser for Star Wars Eclipse. It's where they did all of their previous games, this extremely bespoke setup they had. And we all went in. It was me, Ronan, Margot, the narrative designer, and Benjamin Diebling, who was the audio director, as well as all of the sound engineers. And we were down there for on and off for about 4 or 5 days, mainly with Ben Lambert, who plays Stan, but obviously the other cast were there at other points. And working with Ben was really interesting because we had, as I mentioned before, it was essentially a one-man show. There was, I don't want to downplay the contributions of the other actors, especially Tim, who the Stan's supervisor, who is Stan's not moral compass, but he's often that he's the heart of the game in a lot of ways. But Ben had a huge task because we had to record essentially, I think it was 3 days, 6 hours each day. At least 2 of those were in a row. And we recorded, as far as I remember, largely in sequence, minus some brief reshoots, rewrites, which we did sort of a couple of months later, and the Barks, which were a whole day by themselves. But the majority of it was done in order, which was super helpful for me. I say for me, I wasn't doing much. Super helpful for Ben, I hope, in order of like trying to gauge the level of emotion and level of sort of intensity of all of these lines. And I was there mainly to, I guess, supervise the tone, supervise how I intended certain lines. It was interesting because I was the only native English speaker in the room, apart from Ben, because the whole production team, everyone on Quantic side, on Parallel side, were native French speakers. My French is okay. It's not great. They've all got much better English than I have French. But it was useful for me to be there, I think, to try and, just check that things were being said in the right way, that this goes up instead of down. Yeah, it was a fantastic experience, and Ben and the rest of the cast were absolute pros and really enlightening to work with. It's great when you hear your script in the mouths of people who elevate it from what you thought it was going to sound like on the page, and they'll come at it in a slightly different way, and you'll be like, oh, yeah, that's just better. That just worked better. So that was it was extremely enlightening because it was only the second time I'd ever done that in the studio. So no, it was fantastic. It was a really extremely good experience, and all of the voice acting I've been a part of since it remains one of my favorite parts of the process.
You mentioned that the motion capture was filmed really early on. How did that work with a changing story and changing dialogue?
So normally, like I mentioned, normally when that happens, I say normally in the cases I've been involved in, it's a risk because obviously, as you say, stories can change, words can change, context can change. But as far as I understand, most of what was recorded, because that overarching structure was set at the start, it worked well because the motion capture there is in the game, the scenes are quite short. A lot of the motion capture was for Stan's movements in game. So, the walking animation, there's a great scene in the making of the motion capture action being held back by two other people to simulate the sort of pull of the tides or pull of the weight of the water at the pressure when you're under the water. And the few like story sequences, cinematic sequences we had, they were key moments that, although the story, like I said, expanded and evolved a little bit, the structure sort of there was a sort of expansion of it, they still remained. So we had those key anchors to sort of keep the story, to tie off the story. And then if we need to do something else, often we found we didn't need those. So those specific motion capture sequences weren't required. So it worked very cleanly, I think. And this is me as someone who was sort of siloed off a little bit. But as far as I understand, there was no great, huge loss of assets or anything like that because the story changed. So yeah, it worked surprisingly cleanly.
Are there any fun, small little details that you've added into the game that you really like, but you haven't seen too many players notice?
That's a good question. So let me think. There was a couple of Easter eggs in both Mercury's like daily facts and also in the shipwrecks. So Mercury, the computer, originally played a much bigger role. When I first came on, Mercury he existed outside of the life module. In the game itself, he is essentially a very, very basic, he's Siri, I guess, like even more basic version of Siri that Stan can interact with when he's in the life module. But when I first came on, it was almost Cortana level. He was going out with, he was the voice in Stan's head through a lot of the game. That was in conflict with Tim a little bit. And the idea of like where the player's attention was being drawn was a little dicey, simply because I think we wanted Tim to be the main voice when Stan was out doing his everyday tasks, and Mercury would be more a home base character. And also it was sort of pushing believability a bit. I mean, the world itself is this retro 70s, but what if tech had moved on a little bit? But having a completely sentient AI was a little bit moving away. It was going more into pure sci-fi. But in a lot of Mercury's daily facts, if the player clicks on him enough, he'll spit out something either sort of slightly askew, or we were trying to, especially towards the end of the day sequence in the game, we wanted to get a little bit creepier. So there's one point where, again, this is spoilers, Stan has a dream about he meets with this representation of his daughter Pearl, and his daughter has died, and there's this presence in the waves, and we tried to leave it ambiguous as to whether it was real or whether it was him suffering from nitrogen narcosis. And he has a conversation with her about death, and he talks about losing her, and he wakes up, and if you click on Mercury enough times, Mercury will say, fact of the day, she's never coming back. And I just wanted it to be, I love that sort of, that creepiness from something that comes, goes, and doesn't, you don't hear it again. There's also a System Shock reference in there. At one point, Mercury says, I'm going to forget the quote now. Oh yeah, he says, assistant, the title suits me well, which is a reference to Shodan, God, the title suits me well. One of the achievements is a reference to Lovecraft because it involves a squid. So we had to get a Lovecraft reference in there somewhere. It's in the language of Cthulhu, so I'm not going to try and quote whatever it is. And of course, on my side, my birthday is in there as one of the crate numbers, which isn't particularly interesting. And all of my friends all of the various horrible members of Unitrench are just named after my friends because, I had to get them in somewhere, but I didn't want to be too nice to them.
So let's talk a little about the two endings. You have the ending where Stan stays with Ghost Imagination Pearl and dies and is in the afterlife with Pearl. And then you have the ending where Stan leaves and then goes on and lives his life. Can you tell me a bit about creating these two endings and why you all picked these two as the endings? And were there any other possible endings that you were thinking about but just decided against?
These two were always, as far as I remember, these two were always the only. It was to leave or stay. And I think they weren't always there, but I think it's a fairly binary choice because at this point, again, hopefully we've left the story ambiguous enough that the player can choose whether or not what Stan is seeing is real. So they can frame it as either a ghost story or a story of a man, undergoing stress and being in a very stressful situation. And, something's got this company that he's working for we hype it up as not being particularly worker conscious. So it's the idea that maybe something's just gone wrong. So we wanted to allow the player to decide how Stan deals with this grief once he's fully grasped the grief that he's dealing with. And those two options, as you say, are to stay or to leave. And we didn't want to make one. The stay one, for me, it's the more interesting one because it was a challenge not to make it too bleak. Because if Stan stays, essentially it's a death allegory. It's it's the Grey Havens or something like that. It's him choosing to give up on himself, his life, his wife. It turns out that Emma, his wife, is pregnant halfway through the game, and it's quite dark. Him turning his back on that, but we also wanted it to come from, even though it's a fundamentally selfish choice, we wanted it to come from a place of understanding, at least have the player understand where it comes from. We didn't want it to be man abandons pregnant wife, even though that's actually literally the case of what it is. We didn't want it to come across as like purely bleak. So I wrote this thing based on the idea of, it's going to sound very pretentious, Boethius's wheel, the idea of life being a cycle of ups and downs. And I sort of changed that slightly to being about, the cycle of death and life, and Stan believing that he's somehow found a way to stop that wheel. Mm. And the final scene of that ending is not him. It's not him dying under the waves and slowly running out of oxygen, even if that is implied. It's him in this dreamscape playing with this phantom of his daughter, sort of implying that he's happy. He's made his choice, and he couldn't deal with the grief, and he had to resort to this place of happiness. But I also tried to make it clear that he's doing it out of a sense of obligation, that he lost his daughter. He feels there's an implication. There was in earlier drafts more of an implication that Stan blames himself for the death. Like, I don't think we ever come out directly and say it, but it's implied through environmental design in some of the dream sequences, and also some lines that Pearl died in a car crash and Stan was driving. And the idea of guilt, it's this idea that he couldn't really deal with it. And he felt that he'd lost her, he'd let her down before, and this time he wasn't going to do that. And it was funny because I wrote that having not really knowing how it would look. And that's one of the things that's common in all game writing, I guess. At least when I was working in, like I said, slightly siloed off, I didn't know what it was going to look like. And seeing that sequence once they'd finished doing it, it was perfect. There was some slight edits that needed making and stuff when the final version was ready. But yeah, I was very happy with the one with how that came out. And the other side, being the leave one, is obviously the more. I like that. I don't think you can call either of them the good or bad ending. They certainly weren't designed to be good or bad endings. They were designed to be endings. And the leave one is a bit more cheery. I just made myself laugh because it's not cheery at all. It's a bit more. It's closure. It's the closure ending. It's where he realizes that he's dealing with concepts beyond his control, and that he can't. By staying down there, he realizes that he now has obligations beyond his own self grief, self guilt, and choosing to come away from that is an idea that he eventually comes to. And I do like that ending. I think it still fits, but like, I think dramatically in my mind that the grief ending was always, I mean, call me a cynic, but the grief ending is always the one that it's the one I chose when I first played through the finished build of the game. It's this idea of this man who sort of, although he's faced with the reality of what the situation, he still can't handle it, and he has to just sort of remain there, I guess, with this phantom of his past life. That's very cynical, but that's the one I played.
What do you feel was the biggest challenge that you faced while working on Under the Waves?
I don't have children. And this is a story about the death of a child. So I was very aware from the very start of the game that this was something that I was going to have to be very careful with. Lived experience is not necessary, I don't think, in every case of being a writer. I think in some cases it is. I think if you are writing about a certain race, about a certain sexual orientation, about a certain gender, and that is key to the narrative, hire someone of that associated demographic. And in this case, I think as the story was more about grief rather than fatherhood, rather than the sort of trials and tribulations of fatherhood, it was about grief. We've all suffered grief, so I think I was able to sort of bring my experiences of that to this. But that was the thing that I was most worried about, certainly, was that I wasn't going to do this story justice, was that I was going to write these sort of meditations on grief and they were going to fall flat. And thankfully, we had mock reviews, we had player tests. I had very good feedback, as in not positive, but like constructive feedback from Ronan and Margot and the rest of the team. And that was incredibly emboldening to make that journey into the. I personally can't think of any worse situation to be in terms of the depths to which the grief goes, is the loss of a child, and a young child at that. And then it's this idea that there's the guilt associated with it. And I desperately didn't want to be movie, blockbuster sad. I didn't want to have it be all like out there. Like I said, we don't ever mention how she died. We don't relive that moment. We don't have Emma talking to Stan directly about, I've never forgiven you or something like that. And that was the hardest for me. And I can't say I was entirely successful, I don't think. I think there were some moments where I think I could have pulled it back even more. And I think this is on me. This is my writing where I perhaps was too concerned with clarity, too concerned on intention, that perhaps sometimes the writing was a little on the nose. I think I'm a voracious reader of reviews for games that I've written, which is terrible. It's an awful way to exist. Don't recommend it at all. But a few have pointed out quite rightly, I think, that a lot of both the environmental side of things and the grief stuff, some of it is a little on the nose. And I take that as being a fault of the writing rather than any other aspect of the game. And I think it's simply because I was a little worried with that clarity issue of like, does the player know what we're talking about here? But that was, so I could have held back, let the game speak for itself a bit more rather than having specific dialogue lines associated with it. But on the flip side of that, I don't want to do myself down too much, I guess, that we have had feedback that's been extremely good. We've had at least one correspondence that Ronan sent on to me, which was someone dealing with loss and found the game helpful in that respect. So again, that's not just the writing, that's the atmosphere of the thing. It has this extremely evocative environment of both calm and isolation that I think, again, elevates any words that I put into the game. But that was definitely the hardest thing for me, was knowing that I was writing about something very serious and hoping to do it justice. And also that it being a narrative-based game, the narrative is very forward. I knew how many people were working on this game, and I was hoping to do everything that they were doing, hoping to sort of do justice to that, which I can't comment on, but not unbiased anyway. But yeah, because honestly, the rest of places where often there are hitches just didn't exist, because the process on my end was so smooth. They were an absolute joy to work with, even when it came to the points where, as I mentioned before, like I wasn't aware of the blocking, for example, of a particular scene. Ronan just encouraged me to write it as I envisaged it, and then we'd have a back and forth, like, oh no, this doesn't actually work because this character is over here, or this character isn't in this, that sort of thing. And I had the time, thankfully, to edit and rearrange scenes so they worked with the constraints that we had. So that was all perfectly smooth. It was more certainly on my side and trying to do justice by the themes that we were dealing with.
Looking back now, is there anything that you wish you could have done differently before the launch of the game?
I think I got into some of it a little bit in that last question, but it's I think I wrote a lot of the dialogue as naturalistic as possible. And that included a lot of pauses and a lot of sort of I tried to stage direct through the dialogue, and I think I overdid that. I think that was something that I should have trusted the directors and the actors more with, and I should have just written the lines and let them have more of an interpretation rather than putting in ellipsis every 5 seconds. But in terms of the actual story, again, I think I wish that I trusted. Maybe that's the wrong way to say it. I don't want to say I trusted the player more to interpret what was going on. That's not true, because I think there's still a level of interpretation present. I think I wish I'd had Stan be a little bit less. Those are the emotions that he is feeling. Occasionally, he will vocalize. Hopefully not in too clunky a way, but perhaps in more a sort of overt way than I'd wanted. And I think I could have pared back on that a little bit. Like I say, let the atmosphere speak for itself. Let the player exist in the moment. Occasionally, a bit more in the scripted scenes, certainly. But yeah, the rest of it, I think, again, we had such a good back and forth between myself and the studio, that the majority of the intention of what we set out to do it is there, which is again fairly rare in my experience. Like, there's always things that get cut or intentions that get changed, but the vision was so clear from the start that it was a relatively painless process.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Big old NDA, I can't say. But alongside Under the Waves, Harmony Fall of Reverie came out, which was a game from Don't Nod, which I had a blast working on. That came out, I think, actually it came out a little bit before Under the Waves, but that was another fantastic experience. Like, again, with Under the Waves, those two have been my most rewarding experiences, and a lot of Harmony was working with the voice actors, which was incredible. Again, the people who don't know, Harmony is like Don't Nod's first visual novel adjacent sort of game. And obviously it's all narrative. Every line in the game, besides the internal monologues, are voiced. And I was working alongside 3 other writers, Anthony Janot and Grim Baccaris. And that was incredible. And in terms of what's coming up, I can't speak about the actual projects, but it's a lot more design work. It's a genre that I've never worked in before. And it is trying to marry technical systems, mechanics, a lot of mechanics, with narrative design systems that are not usually present, or at least not present in as much as such quantities, and working with some fantastic people on that. But yes, the company, the industry standard of I can't actually say anything about it until it's released sort of applies, unfortunately. But again, with Act Zero, as you mentioned, with an agency, which is a joy that I have several projects at once. There's a couple of writing gigs coming up, which is nice for projects that, again, it's fun to have like a complete different range of projects. You have sort of, I probably term Under the Waves, like a reasonably big indie game. I think like a triple I don't even know if that exists. But we have like like a double A game coming up, and then some smaller indie games. So yeah, keep him busy. Keep him busy.
Exciting. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It was great to interview you.
Thank you so much, Miles.
And that was the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Also, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to leave us a review. And if you think a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to follow and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.